One of the men made a broom from the branches of a tree, which he used to effectively push the leaves aside. I jumped over the gutter, sat against a tree, and throughout the night thought about my uncle and then my father, mother, brothers, friends. Why does everyone keep dying on me? I walked up and down the road, trying not to be angry. In the morning, people stood up and dusted themselves off with their hands. Some of the men washed with dew. They shook leaves off little plants and trees, rubbing the residue of water onto their faces and heads. After hours of waiting impatiently, we heard the clunking of an engine down the road. We weren't sure if it was the bus, so we gathered our bags and hid in the bushes near the road. The sound of the whining engine grew until the bus could finally be seen. Everyone ran out of hiding and hailed the bus until it came to a stop. We hurriedly piled on and were off. As the bus proceeded, the apprentice came around to collect the fare. I paid half price because I was under 18, but half price in those times was more than full price when everything was peaceful. I looked out the window and watched the trees go by. And then the bus began to slow down, and the trees were replaced by soldiers with big guns, all aiming at the road, at the bus. They asked everyone to step out of the bus, and then they made us walk through a barricade. I looked around, and in the bushes, I saw that there were more men, with some machine guns and grenade launchers. I was observing the formation they had, and almost ran into a soldier who was making his way to the bus. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and a face that said, "I will kill you if I want to, and nothing will come of it." The look was familiar to me. They checked the bus for reasons nobody understood. After a few minutes, everyone was on board again. As we gradually started moving, I watched the barricade disappear, and I recalled when we used to attack such barricades. I dismissed the thoughts before I was transported back to those times. There were too many barricades, and at every one of them the soldiers behaved differently. Some demanded money, even when passengers had correct documents. Refusing to pay, one risked being sent back to the city. Those who didn't have money had their watches or jewelry or anything of value taken from them. Whenever we were approaching a roadblock, I would quietly start reciting prayers that I hoped would aid my passing through. At about 4 in the afternoon, the bus reached a town called Cambia, its final destination. For the first time since we left the city, I saw some of the passengers' faces relax a bit. But soon enough, our faces were tense again, and we all grumbled as the immigration officers also asked us to pay before we could cross the boundary. Everyone reached into their socks, the hem of pants, under head ties to get the remainder of their money. A woman with two 7-year-old boys pleaded with the officer, telling him that she needed the money to feed her boys in Conakry. The man just kept his hand out and yelled at the woman to step aside. It sickened me to see that Sierra Leoneans asked money from those who had come from the war. They were benefiting from people who were running for their lives. Why does one have to pay to leave his own country, I thought, but I couldn't argue. I had to pay the money. The immigration officers were asking for 300 leones, almost 2 months' pay, to put a departure stamp in passports. As soon as my passport was stamped, I crossed the border into Guinea. I had a long way, over 50 miles to get to Conakry, the capital, so I walked fast to take another bus that would get me there. I hadn't thought about the fact that I didn't know how to speak any of the languages in Guinea. I became worried a bit, but I was relieved to have made it out of my country alive. The buses to Conakry waited on the other side of a checkpoint that had been erected by Ghanaian soldiers. There were men standing near the checkpoint, selling Ghanaian currency at whatever rate they pleased. I thought the soldiers would be against such black market foreign exchange, but they didn't seem to care. I changed my money and walked toward the checkpoint. The border was crowded with soldiers that either didn't speak English or pretended not to. They had their guns in ready positions, as if they expected something to happen. I avoided eye contact, afraid of what they might see in my eyes, but I, too, had once been a soldier in the war that I was now leaving behind. There was a dark brown wooden house through which I had to pass to get to the bus. Inside the house, the soldiers searched people's bags, and then the people would go outside and present their documents to the officials. When I was in the wooden house, the soldiers tore open my bag and threw all of its contents on the floor. I didn't have much, so I had little difficulty repacking: 2 shirts, 2 undershirts, and 3 pairs of pants. I emerged from the wooden house and felt as if all the soldiers were looking at me. We were to present our documents, but to whom? There were too many tables. I didn't know which one to go to. The soldiers sat under the shade of mango trees, dressed in full combat gear. Some had their guns hanging by the straps of their chins, and others placed theirs on the table, the muzzle facing the wooden house. This way, they made people nervous before they asked them for money. A soldier who sat on the far right of the lined tables, a cigarette in his mouth, motioned for me to come over. He put his hand out for my passport. I gave it to him without looking at his face. The soldier spoke a language that I couldn't understand. He put my passport in his chest pocket, took the cigar out of his mouth, placed his hands on the table, and sternly looked at me. I looked down, but the soldier lifted my chin. He took the cigar out of his mouth and examined my passport again. His eyes were red, but he had a grin on his face. He folded his hands and sat back in his chair, looking at me. I smiled a bit, and the soldier laughed at me. He said something in his language and put his hand out on the table again. This time, the grin on his face had disappeared. I placed the money in his hands. He smelled the money and put it in his pocket. He pulled my passport out of his pocket and motioned for me to go through the gate. On the other side were a lot of buses. I was confused about which one to take to Conakry. Every time I tried to ask for directions, everyone I tried to ask for directions didn't understand what I was saying. The only word I knew in French was bonjour, which did me no good. I was confusedly looking for a bus to the capital when I bumped into a passerby. Watch where say you dare go, a passerby grumbled in Creole. Me not sorry, sir, I replied. How de body, I continued, shaking my hands with the stranger. Me body fine, and waitin' you dare, don't I some pickin'? The man asked me. I told him I was looking for the right bus to Conakry. He told me he was heading there as well. The bus was overcrowded, so I stood for most of the trip. In over 50 miles to the capital, there were more than 15 checkpoints, and the soldiers were unmerciful. All of the roadblocks looked the same. Jeeps with mounted guns were parked along the road. Two soldiers stood by the metal pole stretched across the road from one gutter to another. On the right, more soldiers sat under a shack covered with tarp. There were a few compartments in the shack where the soldiers searched people. They had set a fixed price for all Sierra Leoneans. Those who couldn't pay were kicked off the bus. I wondered if they would send the people back to the other side of the border. Under the auspices of the man I boarded the bus with, I was able to pass some of the roadblocks for free. Most of the soldiers thought I was the man's son, so they checked his documents and not mine, and charged him for both of us. I don't think he noticed. He just wanted to get to Conakry, and it seemed money wasn't a problem for him. At one of the roadblocks, the soldiers took me into a room and made me undress. At first, I didn't want to take my clothes off, but I saw them kick a man on the floor and rip his shirts and pants. One of the soldiers took my belt. The belt buckle had the head of a lion on it, and it was my favorite. I held my pants with one hand and ran back to the bus. I pressed my teeth hard together and folded my fist, holding back my anger. At the last roadblock, a soldier asked me to put my hands on my head so he could search me. When I raised my hands, my pants fell down, and some of the passengers laughed. The soldier picked up my pants and tied them with a shoelace he had in his pocket. After he was done, he put his hands in my pocket and took out my passport. He flipped the pages and gave it back to me. I followed behind the people who waited in line to get their entry stamps. I was shaking with anger, but I knew I had to calm myself down if I wanted to get into Conakry. I overheard people saying the cost of the entry fee was the equivalent of 300 leones. I only had 100 leones and needed it for the rest of my journey. What am I going to do? I thought. I had come all this way for nothing. I couldn't even afford to return to Freetown if I wanted to. Tears had begun to form in my eyes. I was nervous and couldn't see a way out of this. I was beginning to feel anxious when a man whose passport had just been stamped accidentally dropped two of the many bags he carried as he was going around the checkpoint to reboard the bus. I hesitated for a bit but decided to take the chance. I left the line and picked up his bags and followed him to the bus. I sat on the back seat, slouched in my seat, and peeked to see if the soldiers were looking in my direction. I sat on the bus until everyone had reboarded it. The soldiers didn't come looking for me. The bus began to pulse away slowly and then gathered speed. I had entered the country illegally, which I knew would later become a problem. As the bus headed for Conakry, I began to worry since I didn't actually know what to do once I got there. I had heard that the Sierra Leonean ambassador let refugees sleep temporarily in the compound of the embassy, but I had no idea where the embassy itself was located. I was sitting next to a Fulani fellow by the name of Jallo, who said he lived in Freetown. We talked about what the war had done to the country. Afterward, he gave me his phone number and asked me to call him if I needed help getting around the city. I wanted to tell him that I had no place to stay, but he got off before I could summon the nerve to confide in him. I looked about the bus for the Sierra Leone man I had bumped into, but I couldn't find him. A few minutes later, the bus came to a halt at a huge station, its final destination. I got out and watched everyone go. I sighed and placed my hands on my head and then walked to a bench and sat down. I covered my face with my hands. I can't sit here all night, I kept mumbling to myself.